Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. Well, Tim, so more Sacramento budget intrigues. What's the latest?
Well, we have officially kicked off budget season. Governor Newsom on Friday released his what they call the May revise, or the updated version of his January budget plan. And the governor projects, can you believe it? We have a $97.5 billion surplus.
Unbelievable.
You know, I was thinking about it. I mean, I remember from my time at the Capitol, sometimes we had years where the general fund budget was not even $97 billion. About a decade ago, when we were kind of in the midst of our financial mess at the time and budget mess, Jerry Brown's 2011 budget, so it was the first budget that Jerry Brown put through, it had $129 billion in total spending and just $86 billion in general fund spending. By comparison, Newsom's budget has $300 billion in total spending.
It's huge. And that $97 billion surplus is probably more than the budgets of a lot of states in the country. It's really an amazing amount. But less taxpayers think that they're going to have access to that money. Probably not. Only half of it is discretionary. The rest goes into education. And the governor's got various spending priorities, more COVID relief, homeless. Hopefully he'll be able to deliver on some of these spending priorities, and we won't get the kind of crazy mess that we back in the COVID era when the EDD was handing out checks left and right to all kinds of people, even criminals.
Well, that's 100% correct. You know, we don't do nearly as good a job at oversight, which is a key function of certainly the legislature. So we really don't have any idea whether this money is going to be spent or spent effectively. I mean, we've written about how all the money we're spending on homelessness, you know, what do we have to show for it? But what is interesting is that despite having a $97.5 billion surplus, the legislative analyst says, wait a minute, we could have $25 billion deficits just around the corner. And that's because of the GAN limit. The GAN limit is for those who remember, it's from the Prop 13 era, named for Paul Gann, who was the main proponent of it. And it's effectively a state spending limit. And while it's been weakened over the years, it requires that if revenue reaches a certain point, then you have to give some back to taxpayers. Now, because we've had an obscene amount and capital gains revenue from the stock market in recent years, you know, we're almost at the point where we can't fudge it anymore. And of course, Newsom and his allies in the legislature, they don't want to give broad-based tax rebates. So Newsom's proposed an $18 billion plan. He's calling it his infrastructure or his inflation relief plan. And there's some other accounting gimmicks that they can use to count, you know, some funding for infrastructure and education and debt payment as counting toward the GAN limit obligation.
Yeah.
So he said,
Tim, on that financial relief, isn't that where he plans on giving the $400 rebate? Isn't that part of that plan as well?
That's right. So he wants to give, as part of that, a $400 rebate per car, up to 2 cars, for every California car owner, as his way to deal with rising gas prices. Well, as I've written, don't spend that money anytime soon, because the legislature hates that. And in fact, Senate President Tony Atkins said that, they called it a one-size-fits-all windfall that benefits millionaires, and that they don't think giving a rebate to car owners is the way to go. I think Newsom probably has the more politically smart approach to the issue, but even if Newsom's rebate was adopted, probably wouldn't get it until about September. So we're not going to get any relief anytime soon. But with the legislature throwing really buckets of cold water on Newsom's proposal, I think that's going to be one of the key things and a real thorny issue to get around. Try to minimize that disagreement, but there's a real wide gulf between what the Democratic legislative leadership has proposed and what Newsom is talking about, and how it gets resolved is anyone's guess. I think there is another group of Democrats in the legislature, not coincidentally, who are facing tough election battles in 2022, they've proposed a plan closer to what Newsom is talking about. Many others have proposed, Republicans and some Democrats have proposed just suspending the gas tax altogether. So there really is no consensus on this. So, some have said in the past that actually crafting a budget in good years when revenue is overflowing is a lot tougher than crafting a budget in down years when we have to make painful cuts. And that might be the case here.
So, Tim, when do you think all of this will get resolved?
Well, some quote budget plan, the main budget bill, will pass by June 15th. They have to do that. Otherwise, if they don't get paid. So a main budget bill will pass by June 15th to tick the box. My guess is it will go over time. But also, too, we don't have to pass all of these bills by June 30th in order to have a, quote, balanced budget. So this could be something that's punted for discussions. Last year we had some of these issues that lingered on, including issues like high-speed rail that the legislature has never agreed with Newsom on how to spend the high-speed rail bond money, what's remaining of it. So this could be an issue that, even though it's an integral part to the main budget, it may be something that lingers into July, and you can pass a budget trailer bill whenever you want. So I think it's something that could linger a while. Meanwhile, Californians are struggling with $6 per gallon gas prices. So I don't know, maybe it's going to take some pitchforks and public outrage for them to speed things up. But Newsom is a pretty smart guy and usually has his pulse on where the public is. And I think where he's at is close to what people expect than what the leadership in the legislature is talking about.
Well, before we move on to our guest, wanted to again invite everyone to our Orange County Gala. The keynote speaker is Kellyanne Conway. It's June 11th, and that's a Saturday at the Balboa Club in Newport Beach. Kellyanne is going to be discussing her new book, which is a memoir. People might know that Kellyanne Conway was actually a prominent pollster and a political strategist before becoming President Trump's advisor. And I'm interested to hear what she thinks of the midterm elections and the direction of both parties.
And, we always put on a great evening. The Balboa Bay Club is a beautiful venue if you've never been there before. So if you want a fun evening, a great dinner, and, be in a very beautiful setting, run, don't walk to buy your tickets today.
That's right. And everyone gets a free book. So our guest this week is Jim Palmer, president of the Orange County Rescue Mission. And that's Orange County's most comprehensive private homeless services provider. The Rescue Mission started with just 9 people, and it's now the largest nonprofit faith-based organization serving almost 20,000 people through Orange, Riverside, and San Diego counties. And they provide 1.7 million units of service, more than 1 million meals. So they do great work. And our Stephen Greenhut, who runs our PRI Free Cities project, caught up with Jim Palmer at the mission. He was given a wonderful tour. Tim, what struck me with the interview is that Jim says that people with addictions get about 7,000 signals a day in their brain, encouraging them to take that drug or have that drink. And that just says to me that the whole housing first policy would never work and that it has to be treatment first. If you house someone without treatment and they're getting all of these thousands of signals a day, you can't even begin to make a dent in the problem.
That's right. Also, too, what was interesting, when we talk about the debates over Prop 47 and Prop 57 and this impact on shoplifting and so-called petty theft, that he really says that for these who have terrible substance abuse problems, Prop 47 and the kind of slap on the wrist that you get for shoplifting, it really provided what he says, it's a funding source to sustain their habit, which they never really had before that change in the law went into effect. So, really, when you hear him say something like that, really leads you to believe that we're not going to make any real difference on this shoplifting issue and on certainly the rampant drug abuse we see on our streets till we get a hold of some of these and change some of these policy mistakes like Prop 47 and 57. It's a really interesting interview. I think our listeners will really enjoy it.
Yes. So thanks everyone for listening. And here's Jim Palmer.
I'm Steve Greenhut here with the Free Cities Project. We're here with Jim Palmer, president of the Orange County Rescue Mission and a leader in thinking about homelessness in effective ways and not just ways that spend money. So, Jim, could you introduce yourself and explain this facility we're sitting in and what's going on around here?
Sure. I entered into sort of a calling to help the homeless at the age of 14. Born and raised in Newport Beach, California, and a woman and her son became homeless that I knew, and I tried to do everything I could to help them. And basically, that sort of charted out the rest of my life in working with organizations that help the homeless. I've been president here at the Orange County Rescue Mission for the last 30 years. And through that process, really learned why handouts don't work and why we need to provide hand-ups. The other thing, too, that we really learned was living here in Orange County, if you build programs and campuses that enhance the community instead of creating magnets, you become welcomed into communities. And that's what we found here at the Village of Hope, which we built on the former Marine Corps Air Station here in Tustin. It's been operating for about 14 years now, and it has 265 beds for homeless men, women, and children. And it uses 2 military barrack buildings, and then we built a chapel, cafeteria, counseling, medical facilities, and things like that to create this holistic campus that allows the homeless to come in at their worst or their most challenged time and address their mental health needs, their physical, sobriety, financial, legal, life skills. So once they go through that program that lasts about 18 months, 85% of them, 2 years after they graduate, are still self-sufficient without the need for government welfare or anything like that in their lives, and are sober and providing for their families.
Oh, that's great. When I came up here, my cab driver, I told him I was going to the rescue mission. He goes, "Oh no, this is just an apartment complex." Right?
Yes.
And I came up here and it looks just like a nice apartment complex, right? Garden apartments. And so what's the key to it having this? It has a nice vibe around here.
Yeah, I think part of it is we don't label people homeless. And let me go back a little bit. So when I get invited to a city council meeting and they want me to come speak about homeless or a law enforcement gathering, I tell them the first thing, you don't have a homeless problem. And of course they gasp and go, wait, what are you talking about? You have an addiction problem. You have an alcoholism problem. You have a mental health problem. You have a divorce and broken families and so on and so forth, and affordable housing at the end of that. Those are the problems you have. They just get labeled homeless. So one thing we did early on is stop calling people homeless, and instead we call them students. We didn't create shelters, we built campuses that the students live on, but the entire focus is to help develop and educate them and treat what their needs are through individual treatment plans so that they can graduate as whole people and be self-sufficient again. And that's really sort of the way we've approached that.
Yeah, and that's key, right, to having buy-in from the surrounding community, right?
It is. And then years and years ago, Roberta Amundsen and I, brainstormed a way to implement a vision that she had to bring beauty to the poor. And we did that initially through the House of Hope in Orange, which we went to build a facility for women and children, found ourselves in the historic district of town, and we're told that we had to build a 1940s historic home to match the surroundings and meet the zoning requirements. So we did, and it was a beautiful craftsman style facility. And what happened next was the women that would come interview with their children would come to the front door asking where the House of Hope was, because there was no big sign on it. And we would tell them, you're here. And then in many cases, they just start crying. And it really threw me off. I had no idea really what was going on. And then finally, one of my female staff that was talking to the women said, they just can't believe that they get to live in such a beautiful place. So at that point, I realized that their self-esteem was raised so quickly that they could then grasp onto the program before them and move ahead towards self-sufficiency much quicker. So my next goal was, how do I do this with men? And that's really where the Village of Hope started planning wise. But in the meantime, I was able to secure a ranch that's now called Double R Ranch. And we were able to take men out to this ranch and see the same kind of success that we did with the women.
Well, and people behave in a better manner when it's nice, right? I mean,
they behave sort of like as you treat them, right? Government solutions, these shelters, these emergency shelters that are built are usually big warehouses with bunk beds, and then divided the warehouse between men and women. And people feel warehoused. In fact, so many homeless won't go into them that they all have vacancies in many cases, because homeless people don't necessarily trust other homeless people. And that's something I think people don't realize. It's not like there's this whole group of people that wear the same label that interact with each other. If you were to talk with someone that's become recently homeless, they would be scared to go to a traditional shelter because they would feel that they could get raped, mugged, their stuff will be taken. They don't feel safe. Mm-hmm. And that's a perspective I think people don't really realize out there.
Yeah, and you had mentioned a little earlier about the idea of creating a magnet, right?
Yes.
And that's one of the frustrating things as someone who wants to deal humanely with the homeless. But then it is true. I've seen it. I see it in the north side of Sacramento. And then it just becomes this magnet, and this kind of disorder spreads into the surrounding neighborhoods. So I think the neighbors have some legitimate concerns of that, right? And how do you hit that balance?
So there's a couple ways, but you're right. When I started here 30 years ago, one facility in Santa Ana, now they had moved it out of downtown Santa Ana because at the time, back in the 80s, there were 17 homeless people in Santa Ana, and the city council thought that was horrific and that the rescue mission had caused it. So they moved the rescue mission a couple miles away into semi-residential next to a park. But that, and then county social services moving next door, created this magnet, because at the time, traditional programs like soup kitchen, like people being able to just come in and sleep on, the floor or mats and things like that, that sort of handout kind of mentality was happening, and it just infected the whole community. It got so bad that President George W.H. Bush named it as one of the weed and seed districts, which meant one of the most violent square mile areas in the region. And it had created that. And as soon as I was hired, I started wondering, well, wait a second. These people that are coming in are selling drugs. They're not doing anything to change their life. They're just taking free handouts. And I think that's what we see in many cases. When you have, let's say, a soup kitchen in a community and the city is now trying to move it or shut it down, is because they're no longer just feeding those that are truly in need, but in many cases it's attracting free meals for those that are addicted, that are selling, that are stealing. Because one thing you have to think about is if you're addicted to a substance, an illegal substance, you're having to pay for that in some fashion through prostitution, through theft. We see a huge uptick in retail theft because we have a huge uptick in addiction right now, and Prop 47 and other things that I'm sure we'll talk about.
Oh, yeah. So that's, well, before we talk about some of the policy things, let's deal with some of the numbers. I mean, it always impressed me when I talked to you about the high percentage of people who self-identify as having a mental illness or an addiction. Yeah. And that plays into this whole idea of housing first, which seems to be the catchphrase now. Housing first, housing's a human right.
Right.
But if people are addicted, then that kind of minimizes the effectiveness of that. So maybe start with those numbers.
Yeah, this is something that has really frustrated me because, HUD requires every jurisdiction to do a point in time count every other year as a minimum, where they're supposed to go out and count the homeless. They have a survey component that they create with that to try to identify why the homeless became homeless. The problem is, the way that they set up the survey is the first question is, are you homeless because you lost housing? Are you homeless because you lost your job? Are you homeless because and at the very bottom will be like addiction. Well, someone that's addicted, we know they lost their job because of addiction, then losing their job, they couldn't pay their rent. If you ask the question in a different way, you'll get a response. So years ago, we started screening all the homeless we meet with to ask them to self-identify their issues. And number one was addiction. Number two was mental health. We found that over the last few years, 87% self-identified with a current addiction issue or a current mental health issue. Now, we know from the medical perspective that half the people with mental health issues don't know they have them. So that percentage would be higher. But just at 87% as a conservative number means that if you're looking at housing first solutions, you're only serving 13% of the possible population.
Right. So explain what housing first is.
Yes.
And yeah.
So housing first came about around the 2006-2007 economic drop, and it was really a financial tool. What had happened is HUD and the lenders went to the Treasury Department and said, we have taken back all of these homes, all these bad mortgages. What do we do to sustain these communities? We can't just let all these properties fall apart. We can't resell them quick enough. They came up with this idea of an 18-month subsidy, which later on turned into Housing First. And the idea was that the government would start providing 18 months of subsidy for all of these homes that the banks had, and that programs, nonprofits, and local government could put people in them. And the advocates came around and said, hey, look, this is perfect. And of course, the elected officials thought, hey, look, this is simple. If you move a homeless person into a free apartment or a house for a period of time, they're no longer homeless. It's the best way to deal with the problem. They never look deeper at the true core or cause of the problem of homelessness in someone's life, but instead this easy reaction. And it picked up really big because developers, nonprofit developers, and others made a tremendous amount of money using these government subsidies and continue to today. So simply putting someone in an apartment will not solve the problem, because you have underlying addiction and mental health. Now, if you bring this to their attention, they'll argue two things. One is they'll say, well, we have wraparound services. Okay, that's great. So how many people use the wraparound services? The percentage will be very low. The key to all of this is sobriety. Because somebody that's addicted, their brain's telling them 5,000 to 7,000 times a day, got to get high, got to get back to normal. So how does that person, if your brain told you 5,000 to 7,000 times a day, any kind of message, you wouldn't be able to focus on anything else. So the reality is, until we really treat that, we're not going to be able to treat the bigger challenge of homelessness and the core causes of it.
Yeah, and maybe I think it was you who said this to me, that what ends up happening on these projects, when they build these projects in Housing First and they don't look at whether a person's addicted, is that they end up dying alone in a room, right?
So we saw that in Utah. Utah came out and said, hey, we're the first city to eliminate homelessness on the streets. They did it through a number of different ways, but they create corridors and try to push everyone together, and then they tried to put them all in single room occupancy apartments. So what they found was a tremendous number of overdoses and deaths were occurring, because a typical homeless person on the street, if they overdose, someone would call the paramedics. They would notice. But if they were in their own apartment and nobody else was there, they would just die. And that was, one unanticipated consequence of that thinking.
Right. So what do you do about the addiction issue?
Yeah, so what we do is we start by creating environments that cause the individual to see things in a different way, by bringing in the beauty, by bringing in the program, by not labeling them as homeless. The second piece of that is we focus on addiction and mental health issues. We have the capacities on site in our campuses to actually help address people with those. We live in community. There's a high sense of community here. So new people coming in are supported by people that are here. The people that are here want a facility that's sober. We're very intentional that way. We have drug sniffing dogs that we can bring in. Everyone gets breathalyzed as they come or go from the campus. And that might seem pretty intense, but those living here appreciate it because they're doing everything they can do to make a decision every day to stay sober. So they really don't want to be tempted.
Right. So what do we, meaning policymakers or as a society, what do we do about the people who are addicted, are mentally ill? Well, let's start with the addicted. They're addicted and they don't want to stop, and they're sleeping on a street. They're sleeping in the city park around us, in Sacramento. The parks, you can't take your kid to a park anymore.
Right.
It's just homeless encampments. So what do we do about them? They don't want to come here. They don't want to give up. Some, I'm not saying all of them, but there's a percentage that does not want to. So what can be done?
Well, there's a couple things. One is, I think, putting a greater focus on capacity building for detox. So we operate as a faith-based organization, but detox doesn't need to be faith-based or secular. It could be anybody providing the service. It's very costly for people to go through detox programs, but we don't have enough. So for instance, if Joe on the street all of a sudden decides that he wants to come into a program, and typically that happens after maybe a police officer interacts with them, 15 times. And that 15th time the person goes, yeah, I want to take you up on that place that you showed me a picture of, the Village of Hope. And in many cases, they need to go through detox that either is medically supervised or socially supervised in a detox facility, which shelters are not licensed to do. So we have to do this outside. So capacity building for detox is key, because once that person experiences detox, then they actually want the solution. They want the opportunity to change their life, because all of a sudden clarity has been brought to their thoughts, their mind, and the direction of their life. So that's one area that we can help. The other area is to create more community-based solutions like the rescue mission. And the way you do that is government getting out of the way when it comes to zoning and NIMBY and things like that, and become supportive and make good decisions. And what I mean by that is typically government will go put their shelter in the industrial section of a community, which is really a stupid idea. Because if they were to do it like the Village of Hope here in Tustin, we have houses right down the street that are $2 million. So we're in a very nice part of town, but we're expected to act as a member of that community at that high level, not create a magnet, create a beautiful environment for people to grow in. And so government needs to think about, put housing where housing goes. Don't just go shove it into an industrial section where people come out every day and just wander around these businesses and nobody knows what to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. And but what do we do about the mental health portion, right? Because the detox is one thing. There's a certain part of will that's involved. A person has to want to detox. But some of these people I see, they're just yelling at people, and they're not, they have serious mental health issues.
Yes.
And I don't know. So how do we deal with that? And does any of it tie into, what was it, the Lanterman Act, or some of these efforts that, made it more difficult to institutionalize people? And there were some good reasons for that too. Right. It's a really tough civil liberties issue.
It really is.
So I just was seeing if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I always look at these situations as, what can we do for the greatest portion? Because there's always going to be certain ones that just don't fit any solution we come up with. But I do think on the mental health side that proper diagnosis, proper medication management are really big keys. We have a lot of our population coming in with mental health issues. We have very good screening tools, and then we have professional practitioners that can then work with these individuals. But a lot of it, like bipolarism, comes down to medication management and a lot of support that goes along with that. For instance, what we see is it takes about 1.5 years to balance someone that's borderline with their medications. There's always minor changes that go on to get them to the right spot. And then at that point, they can see clearly, that they want to continue to stay in that spot of being self-sufficient and growing and things like that. So that's really the key. There is discussion on what do you do with somebody that won't, participate in any of that, and that is the big question. Do you give government the power to lock people up again? And that's really what it comes down to.
I know it's a troubling proposition on both either way, right?
It is. I'd rather sort of focus on the larger population of people that we could get into programs like this, get them properly medicated, and that no longer becomes that issue in their life. But yeah, there's always that other one that's creeping around out there that you try to figure out.
Yeah, and then since we're on public policy stuff, Prop 47, which I actually supported it when it was out, so don't get mad at me. But I thought it was a good idea to not prosecute people for minor crimes. But what we have seen is that it's kind of a get out of jail free card to just do anything up to a certain limit.
Right.
So it probably hasn't worked out very well. But explain to me the connection between Prop 47 and the homelessness problem.
Well, let's start with one of the basic items that people are now learning about is that you can steal up to $950 from any store anytime, as long as you don't do it twice in the same day at the same store. And you basically get a citation if you get caught. Now, a couple things have happened. Stores won't really chase you much. They certainly don't prosecute because of the way the law or the initiative set up. The district attorney is not going to prosecute because it's just a misdemeanor at most. And so what we found on the street is that a lot of those that are addicted all of a sudden had an income opportunity to steal, because really prior to that, they could steal, but they get arrested. And that's not a bad thing, because we can do interventions through the jail system. It sort of causes that person to then have to look for a possible solution like ourselves. I don't think people realized at the time that opiate addiction, fentanyl, all these other things were also going to peak, because these two things sort of came alongside each other. And it was a way to really fund addiction on an individual basis by users that nobody had ever seen before. So what you ended up seeing were a lot of shelters go down to like 50% occupancy during the COVID period, the last couple of years, which is at the same point that opiates and other things are peaking in their use. And it became a really big challenge for people that I don't think people had anticipated with Prop 47.
Now, that touches on the issue of homeless courts. There have been proposals.
Yes.
So what do you think? Explain what those are and what you think of it.
Well, we used to love it. So Orange County, I think, was one of the first communities to create a homeless court under what they call community courts. So I think they had like DUI courts and mental health courts and veterans court and things like that. They had this homeless court. We actually hosted it, and it would meet monthly at one of our facilities. And it was a legitimate court. Judge, bailiffs, everybody would come in. But the thing that was interesting is the judges would know who they're speaking to, in a sense. They would know some of the brokenness that goes with homelessness and could articulate possible solutions. But the best thing of all was, in many cases, they would sentence them to programs. They would say, okay, John, I want you to go to a 12-month program. If you do that, I will then clean up your record. We'll not charge you these fees. And then John could pick what program to go to. And in many cases, people picked us to come to. And we saw great success, because during the period they were in the program, they knew if I step out of line or leave the program, I'm going to have to go deal with that judge again. And that judge was seeing these individuals that were in the program, every so many months, asking them to come in and report back how they were doing. And we loved it. But the problem now is the infractions and things like that brought them to homeless court are all gone.
Right. And the judges in those courts were geared towards dealing with homeless. They weren't just geared towards, 90 days or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, so just on nuts and bolts, let's say there's a city and their nice downtown park has just turned into a tent city. What do they do about it tomorrow?
Yeah, the preventative is where you want to put the resource, because once you have a tent city, you have a number of really big challenges. One is it attracts groups like the ACLU and others to come represent the homeless that are in the park. And then from there, there's typically lawsuits and things like that then restrict the actions the city can now take because this community has developed in the park. Now, when these tent cities get, let's say, more than about 20, 30 occupants, that's when the criminals enter into it. That's when the human traffickers show up and others, and they run drug distribution and trafficking in those communities because of one of two issues. One is policing the community is very difficult and very dangerous. The second is that in many cases there might be legal injunctions that are causing the city not to be able to address the encampments. So I say do everything you can in the world to avoid having an encampment. But once you get one, you will have to go through a process of looking for local capacity to be able to move someone from point A to point B, because legally that's the only way you're going to be able to do it or justify to the court that you're allowing this person who says they have a right to be able to sleep somewhere, you're giving them an opportunity within a shelter bed somewhere.
Right, and that ties into the Boise decision, right?
Yes.
And could you explain what that is and what it's meant for?
Yeah, the Boise decision is interesting. It has sort of two big aspects. One is there was a huge encampment in Boise, and the city council decided we've got to remove this because there's all this drug trade going on. And so they went to do that, and then of course they got sued. And they got sued based on the fact that the court said, hey, look, if you're going to force someone to move, you have to give them an option. You have to give them an available bed that they can access. At the same time, there was a weird faith-based component because one of the plaintiffs had a bad experience in a faith-based location. So all of a sudden, faith-based programs were not included as part of the solution, which I think is still a mess that needs to be addressed in the future. So what you have after the Boise decision is when these encampments form and the city takes action, they can immediately get sued by the ACLU or others that might be advocating for the homeless, with the Boise decision saying basically you cannot enforce any of your homeless laws upon this individual unless you give them an opportunity of where they can move. And a lot of cities in Orange County are under those conditions. Right,
and the problem is the way government does things. As someone who's been reporting on it my entire career, I think the term the homeless industrial complex probably is fair, because the people, that you've got and nothing against any of the elements, but you've got the contractors who want their piece,
right,
and the unions that demand this, and then before you know it, and all the zoning restrictions, and before you know it, like in LA, they're paying $700,000 a unit which isn't an exaggeration even.
Right.
So it makes it almost impossible to build those facilities that allow the cities to get people off the streets, right?
Right, absolutely. Up until about 2 years ago, you and I could go buy homes in the area for $500,000, and they're not even necessarily fixer-uppers. And here they're spending $700,000 to build a very small apartment in Los Angeles, and it's absolutely crazy. And there is a tremendous amount of money that is made on the actual development side of these things. And there's a tremendous amount of influx of money right now under Project Home Key in California to go out and buy motels. But these motels don't have kitchens in them and things. I mean, again, we're going to hyper concentrate people with challenges without any guidelines. What I mean by that is anytime there's a government dollar involved, you can't require sobriety. You can't require medication compliance. You can't do any of that. So we all know what's going to happen. It's going to be San Francisco all over the state of California.
Yeah, and we had worked together, was it like 15 years ago or 20? I don't even remember as I'm getting old. But in Stanton, we're talking about the motels.
Yes.
The old motels along Beach Boulevard, which nobody goes to those motels for a vacation.
Right.
Basically become de facto homeless shelters, or one step above, and they weren't great. Right. But then the city decided to deal with it by forcing everyone out, an occupancy a stay of only 30 days.
Right.
And then you'd have these poor, bedraggled people, schlepping all their stuff along Beach Boulevard to the next motel.
Yep.
So what was there wasn't great, but I remember you came and you provided services and tried to do something constructive, but I thought that's probably a good example of cities taking the wrong approach, right?
Yeah, it really didn't solve anything for them. In fact, it actually caused a lot of problems that we have today, because what we found were a lot of single parent families were in those motels. At the end of the day, we actually looked at trying to buy some of them, but because of the drug trade and the prostitution, those hotels are selling rooms by the hour, by the day, by the week, even by the week to the homeless, but it's cash. These were cash cows for the owners of it. And you could never really, it was very hard to find the owners of it, but we went through the process of trying to buy that and got very frustrated. But what we learned is, we really needed to find more capacity for women with children, because people don't typically think of that population as a large population. They think of the single homeless men you might see on Skid Row, and now the single female and things like that. But it caused us to look at how to create communities that would support the needs of homeless women and children.
Yeah, and then I've got, I guess, we'll wrap it up with one last question. Broad question. What's the state doing right and what's it doing wrong?
Oh, wow. That's a tricky question, because I don't think they're doing anything right. What they're doing wrong is you've got everything from, not addressing the NIMBY syndrome to not supporting communities with some zoning opportunities to CEQA issues that need to be reformed, to not getting the government dollars involved in the projects, because as soon as you do that, you can't require sobriety or medication compliance. And those are two huge things, as we discussed. I think what would be helpful is, on the charitable side, is create charitable benefits, in the sense of, if you donate $100, you get $100 credit. There have been discussions in Congress and in the state to do that, just nothing's ever come out of it. So really doing that to stimulate private resources that can be used for private solutions, I think would be very valuable. And the second is government getting out of the way. Because even today, with me being here 30 years, and anybody can Google us up and see the success we've had, we still run into challenges with bureaucrats not allowing permits to go forward, or just causing lots of challenge, which, if they sort of stepped back and let us do it, is if we were a familiar developer that they give passes to. I mean, that's getting out of the way, I think, is a huge thing that local and state government can do.
Yeah, and I like the idea of providing a way for the public to, donate money, because a lot of people really are kind.
Yes.
But sometimes, like my daughter lives, she used to live in a little liberal city in the Pacific Northwest. And people would bring food to this little homeless encampment.
Right.
And she's like, oh my God, it just keeps growing and growing. Well, yeah, if you're there and people, but so there's this kindness going on, but it's maybe making the problem worse.
Yeah, let me give you a good example of that. So we were asked to come into an encampment at a city hall, and it had about 20 people in it. And City Hall finally called and said, can you please take care of this? We said, sure. Give everyone notice, and then we will come in and start providing services, which they did. The first family, we were so excited because it was an elderly man and a wife and a nephew and a child. And we're like, this is fantastic. We're going to get this family out of this tent. So we found an apartment, small apartment. We filled it with food, linens, everything they needed to start. We convinced them to move there. They did move there. We fixed their car with a new battery, got them some gas. The next day, they were setting up their tent. I get a call from our staff, and he goes, they're back again setting up their tent. And I said, what? So I ran over there and sat down with them, and I said, what are you doing? And they said, well, they don't do your laundry over there. And, nobody brought us food last night. We're like, but we put food in the kitchen. Well, yeah, but here you get pizzas every day, and people bring you food, and they do your laundry for you. And you need quarters to do your laundry there. And it was an incredible picture of what went wrong, because good-hearted church ladies, I'll call them, were assisting those that were in the encampment because they wanted to show, God's love to the least, the last, and the lost. They didn't realize that they were literally encouraging them to stay there, so much so that they would pass up a really neat, legitimate opportunity. So we had a great heart-to-heart discussion with the family, and they moved back into their apartment. But it was quite an eye-opener that today, a lot of that continues to go on.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.